Okay. So the first note from this section, which begins on page 40 in terms of your reading, the first note is, according to the Zondervan Handbook of the Bible, what proportion of the Bible is history or story? Now, on the notes that I post, I give page numbers, but ideally, you've been able to read through this already, and some of the questions that I ask, may be kind of minor. You may not be able to remember them right off the top of your head, but if you do, anybody remember what proportion the book said for that? What proportion of the Bible is history or story? Well, over half was the answer that was given on page 46. And so the reading from these pages oftentimes refer to the story, and even last week from pages 11 through 39, or last lectures, when we looked at pages 11 through 39, we talked about story a lot and how important that was to understand that even though the Bible is made up of 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament and 27 in the New Testament, there's a common theme. There's a common thread that runs through all of them. And so it is a story, and we've talked about that, and we'll continue to talk about that to help us to better understand it once we start looking at the individual books within the New Testament. So over half is the answer to that question. Okay, next question. The Zondervan Handbook of the Bible, ZHB, points out the characters of the Bible seem as often to be showing us how not to be people of God as modeling how to live faithful and committed lives. And so what does that imply? The handbook points out that the characters in the Bible seem as often to be showing us how not to be people of God as modeling how to live faithful and committed lives. In other words, we read stories in the New Testament that talk about bad examples people provide, not good examples. This morning, I just happened to read the last 2 chapters of Mark. And so as I finished that particular gospel, I was amazed, how many of you saw The Passion of the Christ? That was a movie in which some people for the first time realized how viciously people treated the criminals of that day, and of course Jesus was considered a criminal by the soldiers who crucified him, and they just talked about how they reviled him, how they mocked him, how they made fun of him, and of course how they tortured him physically to the point of death, of course. So and a few chapters, not the last 2 chapters in Mark, but a little bit earlier than that in Mark, Peter, who is one of the great heroes in the New Testament, Jesus told Peter close to the end of Jesus' earthly ministry, he said, I'm going to be killed, and many people are going to okay, no problem. Many people, all my followers are going to flee. And the disciples said, not me. And Peter himself said, I'll stick with you even if I have to die for you. And Jesus told Peter, well, actually, before the rooster crows twice, you're going to disown me 3 times, because his trial was, kind of illegal by Jewish standards because it was held at night, but they were trying to avoid a mob and a riot because many people thought he was a great teacher. And so, and sure enough, they arrested Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Judas, one of the disciples, betrayed him with a kiss because he had told the soldiers that he led to I know where Jesus is. And so he said, the one that I kiss is the one. And so, they greeted each other with kiss, as, even Russian men in some circles they do today. So he kissed him, and that was the greeting, and that was the signal that he was the one. Even in the dark, they could tell who Jesus was. And so they arrested him, and they took him off to the high priest, and they started house and stuff and doing trials, pseudo-trials, you might call them, and had trouble, doing that. So it took quite a lot of time because they got witnesses and their testimonies weren't agreeing with one another. And then Peter kind of followed and And people would say, hey, aren't you one of them? You know, your accent, or you're from Galilee. And he kept saying, no, I don't know him. No, I don't know him. And finally, the third time he thought, they're gonna arrest me too. And he started calling down curses on himself and making a big deal to try to convince, I don't know the man, and then a rooster crowed right when that happened. So the Bible shows us that the characters who oftentimes, even the heroes, seem to be showing us how not to be the people of God. Well, what does this imply? Well, the answer, what does this imply, is, according to the text, that the Bible story is more about what God has done with people than about what people have done. It's God's story. And that's what it's about. I mean, the people are important because they help us to see aspects of ourselves in them. But it's about God, and it's about what God does in people's lives, not just what people do. Very similar to, the book, other than the Bible has sold more copies than anything else in our country for sure, and around the world as well. But one book that was written relatively recently that sold a lot was Rick Warren's book, Purpose Driven Life. And of course, it's basically a Bible study. And Rick Warren's life, Purpose Driven Life, he's a pastor in California who specializes, of course, on the New Testament and its message. And he began the book by saying, it's not about you. And that's kind of the message of the New Testament, even though we see people in it and we read it because of the hungers that we have and the knowledge that we want to have of truth and history and literature. But it's not really about Peter or Paul or some of these other people. It's primarily about Jesus Christ and about God. So we'll continue to talk even throughout the semester about how God and Jesus Christ are related. So the Bible's more about God and what He's done with people than about what people have done. It's not just a history, but it's this story with God being the central figure. So what we want to ask when we're reading through the Bible is what is God doing here, and how and why? What is God doing? What is God doing here? That's just a good question to ask. What's God's trying to communicate to us? What's the most obvious thing? Some people, when they read the New Testament, they get all caught up in details, and it's easy to do, maybe because of something that's happened to you, or just a question that's burning in your mind, as you read it. But sometimes our questions can lead us away from the main point, and we can get sidetracked by something that's really not that crucial at all. And so, we just want to ask, as we should with anything that we read, really, what's the author's intent? What's the primary purpose of this? If you were a lawyer and you were reading something that was written by someone that you were trying to convict of something, then you would be reading with that perspective of, okay, how can I find some evidence in this to help me convict this person? How can I find, something to help me to prove to everyone that this person's guilty, right? Well, some people, you read the Bible, you bring, you bring questions, you bring attitudes, you bring baggage, you bring everything, like I said in previous lectures, some people believe no matter what, they won't listen to anyone else's argument to help them maybe better understand why. And some people don't believe, and it doesn't matter what you say and what evidence is presented, they've already decided they don't believe. Well, academically, we want to just kind of learn what's the most logical way of reading this to try to learn, how it has influenced history and how it may or may not be able to influence us. And so we need to understand it as a book that is from the large window perspective. It's giving us this story about what God has done through people's lives. Okay. Next question. What does the Zondervan Handbook of the Bible suggest as a possible safeguard against not reading alien meanings into the story? What is a safeguard to help people not to, read something into the text instead of just trying to let the text say what it says? And anybody remember seeing that in the reading? That is on page 48, and it's yes?
Just repeat the question.
Sure. What does the Zondervan Handbook of the Bible suggest as a possible safeguard against not reading alien meanings into the story? You know, just a little mechanism to help you not to be as likely to read things into the text because of, you know, your own background being so different from the background of the authors and the original recipients of the New Testament. And so this is not the only way, but it's one good way. Anybody know? Okay, reading in the company of others. Reading in groups, like, you know, for one, like a college class. But historically, many people who have accepted the message of the New Testament have read in groups, you know, and they've read through the Bible together. Of course, in some places, the literacy rate is not as high as it is in the United States in our time and in industrialized countries. And so many places, you know, not everyone can read. So that's another motivation for them to read the Bible together. You know, the one that reads, you know, if you have some that can read and some that cannot, that of course helps those that cannot read still to be able to hear the Bible stories. But even when you have, you know, there are universities where, you know, people with PhDs get together to read together, you know, the Bible just because you know, so it has nothing to do with who can read and who can't. It's just that they want each other's perspective. And so sometimes, you know, you can share things, well, you know, isn't he saying this? And someone might say, well, it sounds like that, but over here he says this. And so here's a view that's a little more consistent with the whole as opposed to just what we're reading in this one place. So anyway, that's the value of community. And that I like that, and I like to emphasize that because in our culture, we're hyper individualistic. You know, we just feel like we can do everything by ourselves, and you know, we can do things faster, we can do things more efficiently, and we get to call the shots. You know, and it's kind of a population one idea that pervades our society and our psyche. But nonetheless, if we And at least in most times when you're in a community reading New Testament together, there's not a grade writing on it. I know when there's a grade writing on it, most students don't like group work. But when you're just trying to learn, sometimes it's kind of helpful. Now, some students love studying in groups. But for those of you that are hyper individualistic, this is just something to consider to help you to better understand the message of the New Testament. Next question. According to the Zondervan Handbook of the Bible, according to the ZHB, what should you do before you ask what a passage means today? Before you want to know, what a passage means today. Now, of course, some people will have the, maybe slowly, maybe for whatever reason, they will gain the perspective that the New Testament was written by men, but that it was inspired by God. And so they will believe that it has a meaning, a meaning for them. Now, not everyone has that perspective. Some people think, well, this is literature. It was written by men. And they may not believe in God, or they may not believe that God inspired it. They might be from another religion or something. And so they may not think that it has, per se, a meaning for the day. But there are many people who accept the New Testament as authoritative. In other words, they not only believe that it's true, but they believe that it has the wisest course of action for their life. I know a lot of people that have made, sexual purity pledges because of what the New Testament says. You say they believe the New Testament is authoritative, and they've decided, I'm not having sex until I get married because I want to save myself from my spouse. I don't even know who he or she is yet, but I want to begin loving them right now. I'm saving myself because of the message of the New Testament. Other people will say, I really struggle with temptation to drink alcohol, and yet the Bible says that drunkenness is wrong, and so I'm placing myself under the authority of the New Testament and the God who inspired it, and so I'm gonna do whatever I can to get whatever help I need to change my life so that my life honors God and pleases Him, and not get drunk anymore. And so, some people, think that, well, it has meaning for today, and they go in that direction. And so you just got to keep in mind in the context of statements that are made. Again, the handbook is designed not really as an academic textbook, although it does provide the objectives of giving us historical background, and that's what we want, historical background. But you can tell by reading that the authors of the handbook believe in the message. And and so some of the front matter does talk about it in this way. Well, whether you do or not, you can understand their perspective and respond appropriately. So, according to the Zondervan Handbook, what should you do before you ask what a passage means today? And in any particular literature that you feel it has some relevance, if you want to understand what the original author intended, before you use it in a particular way, and people do quote Shakespeare and they quote different authors to make points. And so, what would be the important thing before you ask what a passage means today? Well, the answer. Anybody want to venture a guess?
Looking at the context.
Context is crucial, and that's kind of part of this. But I'm glad you said that, because we can't hear that enough. It's very important to take things in context, and that will come up in our notes time and time again. But the answer that I have here, based on page 51, is that you need to make sure you know what it meant to the original audience. You have to know what it meant to the original audience. When we read in the previous lecture 1 Corinthians 15, and Paul was saying, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you. And that Jesus died and was buried and rose again, and He appeared to many people. You need to know what it meant to the original readers. And so it helps to go back and look at Acts and at the time that Paul spent in Corinth and learn a little bit about that. And, sometimes, there's passages that talk about, not being unequally yoked with unbelievers. Believers not being unequally yoked with unbelievers. And the primary way that's quoted, I think, is parents telling their Christian children not to marry unchristians. But that's really not the original. That's really not what the author was talking about to the original. When Paul wrote to people about not being yoked together with unbelievers, he was talking about not to be too cozy with false teachers. Is probably the most immediate context. But he's encouraging them to support Christian missionaries, but to be discerning, because there were false teachers in that time. And Paul warns about them in some of his letters. So knowing, and now that doesn't mean that principle may not apply to other situations, but sometimes, I know of young people who have looked at that passage and said, hey, this doesn't mean what my parents told me it meant, So it would have been better for them to say, the primary context of, that this is what he said, and this principle, based on this principle, we can deduce that probably this is a good application. And that would at least have be a little bit more consistent with what they look at if they actually read the text later. Okay, so just to repeat, this is not a new one. What should you do before you ask what a passage means today? Make sure you know what it meant to the original audience, because it will vary a little bit, but it will be consistent. And if you understand what it meant to the original audience, then you have a better chance of correctly applying it today. Okay, now, there's some different methods of interpretation that throughout history people have used. You can call these principles of interpretation. In the new catalog that will come out in 1315, there's going to be a new class, a new religion class called Principles of Interpretation, because this is so important and most schools have it, to help people to learn some principles of interpreting sacred texts like the New Testament. So we're going to be talking in a little bit about this, but since this is just a survey course, not very much. Okay, first question in this category then is which method of interpretation, or which interpretation emphasizes the straightforward meaning of the text? Which interpretation emphasized the straightforward meaning of the text. There, the textbook talked about several different kinds. This particular one was borrowed from Judaism, which is not a surprise because all the early followers of Christ and Christ himself, they all came from the Jewish tradition, the Jewish family and nation. And so it was later in history was revived by the reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin. Anybody find it? I didn't give you a page number yet, but anybody find it or remember what it is?
Literacy, historical?
Yeah, literary historical.
Oh, yeah.
Literary historical. And that's a straightforward meaning of the text. In other words, if it says that, Jesus walked on water, sometimes Jesus was talking to his disciples, and I'm changing illustrations there because, but the straightforward meaning of the text, what it says, it means. And Jesus did tell some parables, and we're going to find that many times in the Gospels, Jesus specifically told his disciples, he said, I'm going to be handed over to the officials in Jerusalem. I'm going to be executed, and on the third day, I'm going to rise again. And explicitly, he said that. And then later, the disciples would be talking, and they think, "I wonder what he meant by that." It is like they couldn't grasp that he was saying something that he wanted them to just have a straightforward interpretation. That he wasn't being figurative. He wasn't like being implicit in something that he was, saying. It was just straightforward. But it's true that he told parables at times, and so you interpret parables different, and the context, as Matt said, helps us to know how to interpret things. But one method that was applied throughout history is the literary historical method. It was borrowed from Judaism, and it was revived by the reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin. Yes, Matthew?
The question I've had is when you're interpreting the text, does it help to have